When you wake up to this kind of stuff, and you're coming from sort of atheistic background, one of the questions that keeps coming up is, what else was I wrong about? It became a big theme when I was, sort of researching. The main thing that I was interested in was just researching other people's experiences that were similar. And that led me into all sorts of places. Obviously, the near-death experience, people have such similar stories, There's all kinds of psychedelics out there, and, there's sensory deprivation, there's fasting, there's so many different ways that can trigger these kind of experiences in people. And so that was a big theme, just trying to understand, okay, so this happens. People can have these overnight awakenings. I had a friend that I was trying to wake up, he was suffering, and I kept trying to shake him loose. And I had this monumental experience, and this friend of mine was living overseas, and so I didn't, I tried to explain these things to him a little bit, but then eventually he made a visit. He comes over, and I have this crazy look in my eye, and I'm telling him this crazy story, and he's like, yeah, that's wild, dude, but didn't really, I wouldn't say it affected him necessarily, at least that I could tell. But through this conversation, he eventually, he's like, dude, you sound like Eckhart Tolle. And I'm like, who's Eckhart Tolle? This was kind of before I had really done a lot of deep digging. Compared to some people, this was very shallow digging, but for me, this was pretty deep. So, within a couple days, I go look up Eckhart Tolle, and I'm like, oh, okay, so this guy's like a mainstream-ish, he's on Oprah Winfrey. I think he really got famous because of Oprah. I start looking into his stuff, and one of the first videos I found was him just really telling his personal story. He's such a strange character. He's an eccentric. But, when he starts telling his story about the night that he had his overnight awakening, it was so similar. His was ultimately very simplified. It was very simple. I mean, mine was to some degree, but his was much more singular in its identification of the ego and the perception of self as really the crux of his sorrow and his depression. That was a big deal. It was like, oh, okay, so this guy had such a similar experience, and he woke up, and then, he feels like he's some kind of guru, and he can somehow help people. And I think I went through a phase of struggling with that, because it is sort of like you realize, oh, so there are answers to these questions about existence or about reality, suffering, why are we here? What's the purpose of life? All these type of questions that people have that I think a lot of times drive them crazy. And it's like, yeah, okay, so there are answers. My problems were so, simple. I just didn't have the right narrative or the right language even to use. And so that Eckhart Tolle was sort of the beginning, and then, and I was familiar with Alan Watts and a lot of these guys, but I never really took them that seriously. And so then I go and I listen to some Alan Watts, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the guy. And so, I spent probably 4 or 5 months just listening passively sometimes in the background. I was also doing a lot of carpentry in that period too, which was kind of cool. It was like, I was trying to get my root chakra together. I was fixing the things around me that I could. It was like that clean your room thing. I was just sort of doing it spontaneously. And then when you're doing carpentry, you do sort of realize, things have to happen in a certain order. There's an order to everything.